You sell uniforms for a living, Gunny, so let the adults handle the real hardship in this neighborhood. The president of our homeowners association smiled at the room when he said it. He thought he was putting a desk-bound female Marine recruiter in her place so he could quietly seize an elderly disabled veteran's home over an overgrown lawn. He thought my silence meant I was retreating. Why did that same room go completely dead silent 1 month later when an active-duty combat colonel walked through those doors? To understand how that arrogant assumption led to the complete collapse of his authority, I have to take you back to the beginning. My name is Sarah. I am 38 years old, and for 18 of those years, I have worn the uniform of the United States Marine Corps. For a long time, my life was measured in deployment cycles, flight manifests, and the heavy smell of diesel exhaust in places most people only ever see on the evening news. I was a combat logistics chief. My world was loud, chaotic, and relentlessly demanding. But 3 years ago, the Corps handed me a set of orders for recruiting duty. It is a completely different kind of mission. You trade your tactical gear for dress blue deltas, a crisp khaki shirt, blue trousers, and polished brass. They assigned me to a station in a quiet, tree-lined suburb outside of Columbus, Ohio. For the first time in my adult life, I had a normal driveway. I had a front porch. After years of scanning my surroundings for threats, the profound stillness of a suburban morning felt entirely alien. But I welcomed it. I wanted peace. I wanted to come home at night, take off the uniform, and listen to the wind in the oak trees. To me, recruiting was a mission of logistics and mentorship. Facts over feelings. You find good men and women, you tell them the absolute truth about the hardest job they will ever love, and you prepare them for the shock of boot camp. I liked the work, but more than that, I loved coming home to a quiet neighborhood. My house was a modest ranch at the end of a cul-de-sac in a subdivision called Whispering Pines. If you believe a community should protect its veterans instead of punishing them, take a second to hit the like button. Because I was about to find out just how quickly that peace could be stolen. Next door to me made his home Mr. Arthur Hayes. Arthur was 79 years old. He was a retired combat engineer who had served in the Army. He walked with a heavy wooden cane dragging his left leg just a fraction of an inch, due to a severe spine injury he suffered during his time in uniform. Despite the daily pain, which he never complained about, Arthur was a man of intense, quiet pride. His front porch always featured a meticulously folded American flag resting on a wooden display block. For the first 2 years I owned my home, Arthur's lawn was the absolute envy of the street. It was edged to the millimeter. There was never a single weed in sight. Then the winter took a heavy toll on him. Arthur caught a bad case of pneumonia. He spent a long, difficult month in the Veterans Affairs Hospital downtown. When he finally came home, the wooden cane had been replaced by a metal walker, and his physical energy was simply gone. The heavy spring rains came and his grass shot up. Dandelions crept into the pristine garden beds. The white paint on his wooden mailbox post began to peel. Sometimes life just outpaces you. Sometimes your body issues orders your mind refuses to accept. I noticed the decline immediately. In the military, situational awareness is not a switch you can just turn off. We see a gap in the line and we step in to fill it. I planned to walk over on a Saturday morning and just mow the lawn for him. I figured I would pass it off as needing the extra exercise. But Richard got there first. Richard was the president of our homeowners association. He was a man in his early 50s who treated a volunteer suburban board like a feudal kingdom. He patrolled the streets of our subdivision in a customized electric golf cart armed with a silver clipboard and a laser measuring tape. If your trash cans were left out an hour past dusk, you got a citation. If your holiday lights stayed up 1 day past the 1st of January, you got a fine. He had once forced a young family to repaint the entire exterior of their home because the shade of gray they chose was, in his words, unauthorized. Richard liked power. Not because he wanted to maintain a high standard for the community, because he deeply enjoyed reminding people that he had authority over them. More specifically, he liked power without risk. He only bullied the people he knew would not fight back. Young couples terrified of losing their financial investment, single mothers too exhausted to argue, and now an elderly man with a walker. I was standing on my porch one Tuesday evening, drinking water from a green plastic canteen, when I saw Richard's golf cart stop in front of Arthur's house. Richard marched up the driveway, a bright orange envelope clutched in his hand. He slapped it onto the front door, pressed the tape flat, and marched away with a satisfied little nod. He did not look toward my porch. He just drove away. I set my water down. I walked across the property line. The grass was tall enough to brush against the shins of my uniform trousers. I peeled the orange envelope off the door. It was an official homeowners association citation. $50 for unkempt grass. Another $50 for weeds in the flower bed. I knocked on the door. It took Arthur a long time to answer. When he did, he looked noticeably smaller. The collar of his faded plaid shirt hung loosely around his neck. I handed him the envelope. He opened it, looked over the paper, and his shoulders slumped. He told me it was fine. He said he would hire a neighborhood kid to take care of it over the weekend, but I could see the quiet panic in his eyes. $100 was not a casual expense for a man surviving on a fixed military pension and limited Social Security checks. I told him not to worry about the grass. I told him I had a brand new mower I wanted to break in anyway. He tried to say no, purely out of pride, but I simply told him that one veteran to another, it was my honor. The next morning, I woke up at 6 o'clock, rolled my mower over to his yard, and cut the grass. I trimmed the edges. I pulled the weeds. The mission was accomplished. I figured that was the end of it. I was wrong. Richard did not want the grass cut. Richard wanted compliance. More accurately, Richard wanted a target. 2 days later, another orange envelope appeared on Arthur's door. This time, it was a citation for a rust spot on the garage door hinges. $75. A week after that, a third envelope. The trim around the front windows was fading by a fraction of a shade. $100. It was a calculated, relentless paper siege. Every time I tried to help Arthur fix a physical problem, Richard would invent a new, obscure violation to replace it. He was not policing a neighborhood. He was hunting. And the ferocity of his focus made absolutely no sense. There were other houses with peeling paint, but Richard ignored them completely. Why was he so uniquely obsessed with forcing this one disabled old man into a financial corner? I kept my temper in check. Discipline is about acting with intention, not emotion. I decided to wait for Arthur to ask for my help with the board, respecting his independence and his dignity. But my patience completely ran out on a Thursday afternoon in late October. I pulled into my driveway after a 12-hour shift at the recruiting station. The sun was going down, casting long, cold shadows across the pavement. I noticed a large, heavy-duty piece of white paper taped securely to Arthur's front door. It was not an orange warning envelope. It was a thick, legal document. Arthur's car was not in the driveway. He was at a medical appointment. I walked over the crunch of dead autumn leaves loud under my boots. I stepped onto the concrete porch. I looked at the bold black lettering at the top of the page. It was a formal notice of intent to place a lien on the property. The total fines had magically compounded through hidden late fees and administrative penalties to an impossible $1,200. The notice stated that if the balance was not paid in full within 10 days, the Homeowners Association would initiate foreclosure proceedings to seize the house over peeling paint, over a rust spot. I stood alone on the porch in the fading light. Silence. The notice of intent to lien taped to Arthur's door was not a warning. It was a calculated ambush. $1,200. To a retired combat engineer surviving on a fixed government pension and a monthly Social Security check, that number might as well have been $1 million. A homeowners association has the legal authority to seize a property for unpaid fines, but that power is designed to stop severe, dangerous negligence. Wielding it over peeling paint and a rust spot was a deliberate escalation. I pulled the heavy white paper off the doorframe. I folded it carefully and pushed it deep into my uniform pocket. I did not want Arthur to come home from his medical appointment and find it. He needed rest, not a spike in his blood pressure. In the Marine Corps, when you encounter a fortified enemy position, you do not attack the wall directly. You find a way inside the wire. If I wanted to stop this, I could not fight a paper war from the sidewalk. I needed a seat at the table. Our neighborhood board consisted of 5 members. One of those seats, the member-at-large position, had been vacant for 6 months because nobody wanted to do the thankless administrative work. The other 3 active members were decent people: a retired school teacher, an accountant, and a local nurse. But they were entirely intimidated by Richard's overbearing personality. They just wanted the long meetings to end, so they voted yes to whatever he proposed. According to the community bylaws, any resident in good standing could petition for a direct appointment to the vacant seat if they secured 20 signatures from their neighbors. I spent my Saturday morning walking the subdivision. I wore a plain gray shirt and jeans. I did not mention Richard, and I did not mention the lien. I simply introduced myself, noted that I had lived here for a few years, and said I wanted to help keep the community strong. Most people knew me as the quiet military woman next door who mowed lawns, and they gladly signed their names. I had 25 signatures before noon. I submitted the paperwork to the property management company on Monday. By Wednesday afternoon, I was officially sworn in as the 5th board member. Richard was thrilled. At my first closed-door administrative meeting, he shook my hand aggressively. He told the other 3 board members that he was glad to have a military recruiter on his team. He smiled and said I would be great at taking orders, enforcing the rules, and pushing paperwork. He genuinely believed that was the sum total of my military career. I did not correct him. I simply smiled back, took my seat at the long wooden table, and politely asked the secretary for digital access to the financial records and the community bylaws. My strategy was simple. I would mediate from the inside. I spent that first weekend at Arthur's house treating his property maintenance like a tactical objective. I mowed the grass again. I repainted the peeling mailbox post. I scrubbed the rust spot off the garage hinges with wire wool. I eliminated every single physical excuse Richard had documented. But Richard did not back down. He simply invented impossible new targets. When he drove by and saw the exterior was flawless, a certified letter arrived the next day claiming the soil acidity in Arthur's flower beds was not in compliance with neighborhood standards. $200. When I fixed that, another notice arrived, stating that his roof shingles, which were perfectly intact and not leaking, were supposedly past their manufacturer warranty life. $400. The harassment was relentless. It was exhausting. Arthur stopped sitting on his front porch. He kept his blinds drawn. A man who had survived a war was being made to feel like a prisoner in his own living room. None of it made sense. Richard was arrogant, yes, but this level of targeted harassment required genuine effort. Why was he spending hours of his own time trying to ruin one elderly man? Because I was now a board member, I had the legal right to review the association's financial logs, vendor contracts, and official email correspondence. On a Saturday night, I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee and a thick stack of printed administrative files. I treated them like a hostile field manual. I reviewed every single page. I studied the county property tax assessments. I tracked the flow of neighborhood funds. My day job required me to process incredibly complex personnel files and verify federal background checks. Digging through a stack of community meeting minutes was remarkably simple by comparison. I was looking for a pattern. Arrogant people always leave a trail because they believe no one is smart enough to follow it. It took me exactly 4 nights to find the truth. Arthur was not the first elderly resident Richard had targeted. Over the past 5 years, 2 other older homeowners in our subdivision had been quietly forced out. Both of them had fallen behind on basic maintenance due to sudden, severe health issues. Both of them had been relentlessly battered with an avalanche of obscure fines. Both of them had faced a lien and eventual foreclosure. But the truly sickening part was what happened after they were forced to leave. In both of those previous cases, the association seized the property and the houses were immediately auctioned off to clear the manufactured debt. And both times, the houses were purchased for pennies on the dollar by the exact same local real estate holding company. I went online and pulled the state business registry for that specific holding company. The primary stakeholder and chief executive was Richard's brother-in-law. It was never about maintaining property values. Not because he cared about the neighborhood aesthetic, because he cared about a commission check. It was a highly coordinated, perfectly legal real estate scam. Richard used his petty authority to hammer vulnerable elderly people with financial penalties until their spirit broke. Then his family swept in, bought the property at a massive discount, slapped a cheap coat of paint on the walls, and flipped the house for a premium profit. Now they were closing the trap on Arthur. Sometimes corruption is loud. Sometimes it wears a pastel polo shirt and drives a custom golf cart. I printed every single document. I organized the property deeds, the holding company registry, and the past foreclosure filings into a thick manila folder. I set the folder squarely on my kitchen counter. Facts over feelings. I had the absolute proof. Now I just needed the right moment to present it to the rest of the board. I assumed I had the time. The association bylaws clearly stated that a homeowner must be given 30 days to appeal a lien in a public forum before a final vote. But Richard was entirely paranoid. He knew I was asking questions about the previous board decisions. He could sense a subtle shift in the wind, and he decided to aggressively accelerate his timeline. The following Monday evening, an emergency electronic notice went out to the entire neighborhood. Richard announced a special, fast-tracked public board meeting to finalize the lien on Arthur's home. He cited a rare, obscure bypass clause in the bylaws regarding severe property neglect. He declared that the vote would be final and the foreclosure process would begin immediately. I looked at the scheduled date and time of the emergency meeting. Tuesday afternoon, 2 o'clock. My chest tightened with a very cold, very familiar anger. Tuesday at 2 o'clock was the exact day and time Arthur was scheduled to be downtown at the Veterans Affairs Hospital for a critical, hours-long spinal treatment. Richard knew Arthur's medical schedule perfectly. How? Because Arthur had submitted it in writing to the board months ago, begging for an extension on his yard maintenance. Richard was intentionally holding the execution vote when he knew the victim could not physically be in the room to defend himself. He wanted a fast, quiet kill. He expected the rest of the board to just nod their heads, sign the paperwork, and look the other way. He expected me to sit at my assigned desk, stare at my hands, and blindly follow his instructions. He had absolutely no idea who was sitting next to him. At 10 minutes to 2 on Tuesday afternoon, I parked my truck in the gravel lot of the community clubhouse. The building was heavily air-conditioned and smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Because Richard had scheduled the emergency meeting in the middle of a workday, the audience consisted of exactly 4 people. 2 retired neighbors who always attended, and 2 local landscaping contractors Richard frequently hired. Arthur, of course, was miles away at the Veterans Affairs Hospital, entirely unaware that a manufactured legal guillotine was being positioned over his home. The 5 board members sat behind a long folding table at the front of the room. I took my assigned seat at the far right edge. I wore my service uniform, khaki shirt, blue trousers, polished brass. My manila folder rested flat on the plastic table in front of me, perfectly aligned with the edge. Richard sat in the center seat. He wore a crisp beige blazer, looking profoundly satisfied with himself. He arranged a stack of legal papers on his silver clipboard and adjusted a small microphone. At exactly 2 o'clock, he picked up his wooden gavel and struck the table. He opened the meeting with a deeply insincere speech about community standards, property values, and the heavy burden of leadership. He spun a fictional narrative of Arthur as a hostile, negligent homeowner who was actively dragging down the aesthetic of the entire subdivision. He listed the completely manufactured fines. He spoke with the theatrical sorrow of a man who claimed his hands were legally tied. "It is an unfortunate situation," Richard said to the nearly empty room, shaking his head. "But we have a sworn duty to maintain the standard of this community. A final execution of the $1,200 lien and subsequent foreclosure is our only remaining option to protect our investments." He looked down the table at the other 3 board members. The accountant, the retired school teacher, and the nurse nodded slowly. They clearly hated the situation, but they were entirely intimidated by his aggressive confidence. Richard then turned his attention to me. He held out a plastic pen. "Sarah," he said, his voice dripping with forced professionalism, "as our newest member, we just need your signature to make the vote unanimous." I did not take the pen. I kept my hands resting flat on the table. "I have a motion before the vote," I said. My voice was calm, pitched low so it would carry clearly across the room. "I move that we grant Mr. Hayes an immediate hardship waiver as outlined in Section 4 of our community charter. He is an elderly, disabled veteran. The physical issues with his property have already been completely resolved. I know this because I did the work myself. There is absolutely no moral or legal justification for this board to seize his home today." The retired school teacher looked up, a flicker of genuine relief crossing her face. Richard's smug smile vanished. His face flushed a dark, aggressive red. He dropped the pen onto the table with a sharp clack. He was not used to being challenged, especially by the quiet junior member he assumed he could easily control. He leaned into his microphone, making sure everyone in the room could hear him perfectly. "Let me stop you right there," Richard said, his tone turning remarkably condescending. He looked me up and down. "I appreciate your little bleeding heart speech, but we are running a corporation here, not a charity." He leaned back in his chair, adopting the tone of a deeply patient father explaining a simple concept to a slow child. "You sell uniforms for a living, Gunny," Richard said, emphasizing my rank with a slow, deliberate sneer. "So let the adults handle the real hardship in this neighborhood. Your job is to hand out brochures to teenagers at a strip mall. You push paperwork. You have absolutely no idea what it takes to manage real problems, make difficult executive decisions, or maintain an actual standard. You are a saleswoman. Sit back down and let us handle the real world." The insult hung in the heavily air-conditioned air. In the Marine Corps, there is a fundamental difference between a reaction and a response. A reaction is emotional, chaotic, and almost always destructive. A response is calculated, controlled, and executed with absolute precision. If I stood up right then, shouted at him, or slammed my fists on the table, I would simply look like an unhinged subordinate throwing a temper tantrum. I would play right into his narrative. I would give him the exact excuse he needed to permanently dismiss me. I did not argue back. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at Richard, letting the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable 5 seconds. I looked at the way his chest puffed out slightly, completely unaware of the absolute cliff edge he was sprinting toward. He thought I was a paperwork clerk. He thought the most dangerous thing I had ever faced was a paper cut. That was his fatal, tactical assumption. He had fundamentally confused my current recruiting billet with my actual history. If I opened my manila folder right then and exposed his real estate scam, it would turn into a shouting match. Richard would claim the holding company documents were fake. He would talk over me, twist the narrative, and confuse the board. If I wanted to permanently eliminate the threat to Arthur, I could not just wound Richard's pride. I had to completely shatter his credibility. I needed absolute, undeniable authority. "I understand exactly what you are saying, Richard," I said softly. I offered him a small, perfectly calm smile. I stood up and picked up my manila folder. "Since the homeowner in question is currently undergoing medical treatment and cannot defend himself, I am invoking my right as a board member to formally table this execution vote. According to parliamentary rules and our bylaws, any member can force a 48-hour delay on a contested property action. We will reconvene on Thursday evening at the general public meeting." Richard glared at me. He knew the bylaws perfectly well. He knew I had the absolute legal right to delay the vote once. He did not like it, but he was completely confident he could crush me on Thursday in front of a larger audience. "Fine," Richard scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Tabled until Thursday at 7 o'clock. Bring whatever paperwork you want, Sarah. It will not change a single thing. The lien goes through this week. Meeting adjourned." He slammed his wooden gavel down. I did not say another word. I turned and walked out the double doors of the clubhouse. I stepped out into the bright Ohio afternoon and walked across the gravel parking lot to my truck. I climbed into the cab, shut the door, and let the profound silence of the interior wrap around me. Diplomacy had completely failed. A direct assault was now the only option. But I was not going to fight him with community bylaws. I was going to introduce him to a completely different standard of authority. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I opened my contacts. I scrolled past the recruiting station numbers, past my family, and past the local vendors. I stopped on a number I had not dialed in over 3 years. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. It rang twice.
"Colonel Davis!"
A sharp, gravelly voice answered. "Good afternoon, sir," I said. "It is Sarah." There was a brief pause on the line. Then the voice warmed with immediate, genuine recognition. 10 years ago, long before I was a recruiter, the man on the other end of the line was Captain Davis. He was my company commander during one of the most brutal, heavily classified combat deployments in recent Marine Corps history. We had spent 9 months bleeding into the same dirt in Helmand Province. We had held a crumbling mud compound against a coordinated enemy assault for 3 straight days. I had carried 2 of his wounded Marines to an evacuation helicopter under heavy mortar fire. I left a piece of my own leg in that valley. The bond forged in that kind of crucible does not fade. The oath never expires. "Gunny," the colonel said, "it has been a damn long time. Tell me you are not calling to ask for a transfer back to a combat unit." "No, sir," I replied, staring through the windshield at the brick community center. "I like my quiet driveway. But I do have a logistical problem on the home front, and I need to request a massive favor." "Name the objective," the colonel said. There was no hesitation, no request for context, just the immediate, absolute commitment you only find in the dark corners of the military. I sat in the cab of my truck and gave him the exact tactical situation. I explained Arthur's failing health, the weaponized homeowners association fines, and the imminent foreclosure. I explained the real estate scam I had uncovered, detailing how the board president's brother-in-law had already swallowed 2 other properties in the exact same manner. The colonel listened in total silence. He knew I was not calling him to complain about neighborhood politics. I was calling because a disabled veteran was trapped behind enemy lines and I needed heavy fire support. The problem, sir, I continued, is that the board president currently controls the narrative. He told the room today that I am just a uniform saleswoman. He genuinely believes I have spent 20 years pushing paper at a strip mall. I cannot simply accuse him of fraud because he will loudly deny it and demand proof of my authority to challenge him. He has to completely lose control of the room before I drop the holding company documents. I need to shatter his authority first. I paused, listening to the static hum on the line. I need an officer to verify my service record, sir. In person. I need someone to explain to a suburban homeowners board exactly what kind of paper I used to push. Colonel Davis was silent for 3 seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. What time is the final vote? Thursday evening, sir. 7 o'clock. Right here at the community clubhouse. I have a battalion-level briefing scheduled for Thursday afternoon at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, the colonel said. That is an hour away. I will move my schedule. I am bringing my dress blues. Send me the coordinates. You just make sure he gives you the floor. The line clicked dead. The trap was officially set. The next 48 hours were an exercise in absolute quiet discipline. I went to work at the recruiting station. I processed application files. I ran physical training sessions with the young men and women waiting to ship out to boot camp. I did not mention the homeowners association to anyone. I did not call Richard. Overconfident enemies always mistake silence for surrender. Richard completely bought into the illusion. On Wednesday afternoon, he sent out a smug mass email to the entire neighborhood. He announced the general meeting scheduled for Thursday night. In the email, he reminded everyone that difficult decisions must be made by those capable of making them, and he assured the neighborhood that the prolonged issue regarding Arthur's property would finally be permanently resolved. He was essentially inviting the entire subdivision to come watch him execute his power. He wanted an audience. He had absolutely no idea that an audience was the worst possible thing he could ask for. Thursday evening arrived with heavy gray skies. It rained hard all afternoon, a cold October downpour that left the neighborhood streets slick and dark. By the time I drove to the community center at 6:30, the rain had slowed to a steady, freezing drizzle. Because Richard had sent out the mass email, the main hall of the community clubhouse was packed. Nearly 50 residents had shown up, filling the rows of gray folding chairs. Arthur was among them. He sat in the very back row, his metal walker parked next to him. He looked pale and deeply exhausted. He was clutching a thin folder of medical receipts, clearly prepared to beg for his home. It made me sick to my stomach to see him look so defeated. But I could not say anything to him yet. I had to let the trap spring completely shut. I walked to the front of the room and took my seat at the far edge of the long table. My thick manila folder sat perfectly squared in front of me. I wore my service alphas, the olive drab coat, the khaki shirt, the ribbons sitting heavy on my left breast. Richard walked in at 7:05. He was practically vibrating with smug energy. He wore a navy blue blazer and a red tie. He smiled broadly at the crowd, shaking hands like a politician on election night. He took a seat in the center chair, arranged his silver clipboard, and tested his microphone. He looked at my green uniform coat and rolled his eyes. "Are we expecting a parade, Sarah?" he muttered to me under his breath. I did not respond. I simply kept my eyes locked on the double doors at the back of the room. At exactly 7 o'clock, Richard picked up his wooden gavel and slammed it down. "Let us bring this meeting to order," Richard said loudly, leaning into the microphone. His voice boomed across the silent room. "We have one primary item on the agenda tonight. The final execution of a $1,200 lien and immediate foreclosure proceedings against the property belonging to Mr. Arthur Hayes. A low murmur of extreme discomfort rippled through the crowd. Several people turned to look at Arthur in the back row. Arthur simply stared at the floor. "I know this is difficult," Richard continued, adopting a fake, sorrowful tone. "But rules are rules. We cannot allow our property values to be destroyed by negligence. This board has bent over backwards to accommodate Mr. Hayes. All of it has been ignored. The time for charity is over." Richard picked up his pen. He looked at the other 3 board members. They all looked miserable, but they slowly picked up their pens as well. The intimidation tactic was working perfectly. "Now," Richard said, turning his head toward me with a patronizing smile, "our newest member asked for a delay on Tuesday. She wanted to make a statement tonight, before the final vote. So, let us get this over with. The floor is yours, uniform saleswoman. Make it fast." He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms over his chest, and waited to be entertained. I stood up. I did not touch my microphone. I did not look at Richard. I looked straight down the center aisle of the room, toward the double doors at the very back. "I appreciate the opportunity to speak," I said, projecting my voice so every single person in the room could hear me clearly. "But I am not the one making the statement tonight. According to Section 7 of our community bylaws, any board member can yield their time to a recognized guest." Richard frowned, completely confused. "A guest? What are you talking about? Nobody is on the agenda. You cannot just invent a speaker." I did not answer him. I just kept my eyes locked on the back of the room. "Are you deaf, Sarah?" Richard snapped, his face flushing red. "I said we are done playing games. We are finalizing this lien right now." He picked up his wooden gavel and raised it high into the air, preparing to strike the table and end the vote. He was completely unaware of the man in the immaculate dress blue uniform, pulling open the heavy double doors of the community center. The heavy double doors swung wide open, the brass handles hitting the wall stops with a sharp, heavy crack that echoed across the silent room. Before we see exactly who just walked into that clubhouse, let me ask you a quick question. Do you believe that people who weaponize small amounts of authority always eventually cross the wrong person? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Because Richard had just made the biggest miscalculation of his life, every head in the folding chairs turned toward the back of the hall. Colonel Davis walked in. He was wearing the most formal, commanding uniform in the United States military arsenal. The Marine Corps dress blue alphas, a midnight blue tunic, a crisp white cover, a high collar, and gold buttons that caught the harsh fluorescent light. A thick red blood stripe ran perfectly down the outer seam of his trousers. The silver eagles of a full colonel rested on his shoulders. On his left breast sat 3 heavy rows of combat ribbons and miniature medals telling a silent, undeniable story of severe deployments and absolute sacrifice. The 50 residents in the audience went entirely still. The low hum of the air conditioning unit was the only sound in the building. Colonel Davis ignored the crowd completely. He did not look at the ceiling, and he did not look at the other board members. He locked his eyes directly onto Richard, and he started walking down the center aisle. The heavy, precise strike of his leather dress shoes against the linoleum floor sounded like a slow drumbeat. He moved with a cold, terrifying purpose. The kind of absolute confidence forged in environments where failure is measured in casualties. Richard was completely frozen in his center chair. His right arm was still suspended awkwardly in the air, his fingers wrapped tightly around the handle of his wooden gavel. His mouth fell open. He slowly lowered the gavel back to the plastic table, entirely disarmed by the sudden, overwhelming arrival of actual authority. The colonel stopped directly in front of the long folding table towering over Richard. He did not carry a silver clipboard. He carried a single, thick, olive drab military personnel folder. "I am Colonel Thomas Davis," he announced. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a razor-sharp edge that easily reached the back row. United States Marine Corps. I currently command the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment. And I am claiming the 3 minutes of floor time yielded to me by my former combat logistics chief. Richard swallowed hard. His patronizing, arrogant smile had completely vanished, replaced by sudden, intense panic. "Excuse me," Richard stammered, his voice suddenly thin and remarkably weak. "This is a private community meeting. You cannot just interrupt a legal proceeding." "I have exactly 3 minutes of yielded time according to your own community charter," the colonel replied, his voice dropping to a dangerous, flat baritone. "And I highly suggest you let me use them. Because the alternative is that I use them to explain to the local authorities why you are attempting to unlawfully seize the primary residence of an elderly, disabled veteran." Richard shrank back into his chair. He looked left and right, desperately hoping for backup, but the retired school teacher, the accountant, and the nurse were staring straight ahead, completely terrified to move. The colonel opened the olive drab folder. He pulled out a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper adorned with an official gold seal. "On Tuesday afternoon," the colonel said, projecting his voice so every single person in the room could hear him perfectly, "the president of this board publicly dismissed Gunnery Sergeant Sarah as a uniform saleswoman. He stated that the Gunny had absolutely no idea what it takes to manage a real crisis, handle real hardship, or uphold an actual standard." The colonel slowly turned his head and looked directly down at Richard. "Before the Marine Corps ordered her to a stateside recruiting station to allow her body to heal," the colonel continued, "this Marine was my lead convoy commander in Helmand Province, Afghanistan. In the winter of 2011, her supply convoy was ambushed and pinned down by heavy enemy machine gun fire in a fortified mud compound. A woman in the second row covered her mouth with her hand. Shrapnel tore through her left thigh," the colonel read aloud, referencing the document. "Despite massive blood loss, she flatly refused medical evacuation. She personally dragged 2 critically wounded younger Marines 70 yards to safety across an open courtyard. She then returned to the perimeter line, directed suppressive fire, and held the compound for 3 consecutive days until heavy reinforcements arrived." The absolute silence in the room was deafening. 50 pairs of eyes slowly turned away from the colonel and locked onto me. I kept my face entirely neutral. I did not move. I just watched Richard. For flawless executive decision-making under extreme duress and absolute disregard for her own safety, she was awarded the Bronze Star with a Combat Valor device, the colonel stated softly. He leaned directly over the table, pushing aggressively into Richard's personal space. "She does not sell uniforms," the colonel said, staring straight through the man. "She is a combat logistics leader. She has spilled more blood for this country than you will ever spill coffee on your blazer." The colonel dropped the heavy cream paper onto the plastic table. It landed right next to Richard's meticulously organized stack of manufactured violation notices. "You called her a saleswoman because you thought she was weak," the colonel continued. "You thought her quiet demeanor meant you had broken her spirit. You made the exact same fatal mistake every arrogant bully makes. You assumed her restraint was a lack of capability. It was not. Her restraint was a professional courtesy. A courtesy you entirely exhausted." The colonel stepped back from the table. He closed the empty olive drab folder with a sharp, heavy slap. "When she asks for a simple hardship waiver for an elderly veteran in her own neighborhood," the colonel said, "she does not do it because she has a bleeding heart. She does it because she knows exactly what a casualty looks like, and she knows when someone is deliberately trying to cause one." The colonel placed the heavy military folder squarely onto Richard's table directly over his silver clipboard. He turned toward me, snapped his heels together, and executed a perfect, crisp salute. I remained seated, but gave him a single respectful nod in return. The colonel executed a flawless about-face movement and walked straight back down the center aisle. He pushed through the heavy double doors and disappeared into the rainy night. The doors swung shut. The arrogant suburban dictator had tried to mock a woman he assumed was powerless, and instead, he had summoned a monster of a record directly into his own clubhouse. The entire room turned and stared at Richard. He looked incredibly small in his center chair. He stared down at the military folder resting on top of his clipboard, completely paralyzed by the sudden, brutal public exposure. His entire carefully crafted persona as a powerful executive had just been systematically dismantled in under 3 minutes. Silence hung heavy in the air. 50 neighbors waited for him to speak. They waited for him to try and justify his actions against Arthur. Silence. Richard stared at the closed olive drab folder resting on top of his silver clipboard. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. The silence in the community center was absolute. He finally looked up, his eyes darting across the 50 residents sitting in the gray folding chairs. He was desperately searching for a single sympathetic face. He found 50 furious neighbors. The illusion of his unquestioned authority had completely evaporated, replaced by a sudden, intense, collective anger. They had heard the official military record. They finally understood exactly what kind of man had been sitting at the center of the table, terrorizing a disabled veteran over a rust spot. Before Richard could even attempt to salvage his destroyed pride, the retired school teacher sitting to his immediate left slid her chair back. The metal legs scraped loudly across the linoleum floor. She did not look at Richard. She reached across the table, grabbed the official notice of intent to lien, and deliberately tore the heavy white paper completely in half. She let the 2 pieces flutter down onto the floor. "I make a formal motion," she said, her voice shaking slightly, but gaining strength with every single word. "To immediately and permanently drop all fines, fees, and legal proceedings against the property belonging to Mr. Arthur Hayes." The accountant did not hesitate. "I second the motion." "All in favor," I said, quietly raising my right hand. The school teacher, the accountant, and the nurse instantly raised their hands. 4 votes. Richard did not move his hand. He sat entirely frozen in his center chair. The legal framework he had meticulously weaponized over the past 3 months had just collapsed in exactly 60 seconds. The $1,200 in manufactured debt vanished into thin air. "The motion carries," the school teacher announced. The entire room erupted in applause. Several people standing in the back row walked over to Arthur and gently put their hands on his shoulders. The elderly veteran leaned heavily onto his metal walker, buried his face in his hands, and wept silently. The terrifying financial weight that had been crushing his chest for months was permanently gone. But the crowd was not finished. The applause quickly turned into a furious interrogation. A young man in the 3rd row pointed a finger directly at Richard, loudly demanding his immediate resignation. The room echoed with angry voices calling for him to step down, to turn over the financial ledgers, and to be physically removed from the building. I sat at the end of the table, my hand resting flat on my thick manila folder. The folder containing the state business registry. The folder containing the absolute proof of his family real estate scam. I had the total tactical advantage. I could open that folder, slide the property deeds across the table, and let the neighborhood completely destroy him. I could push him out of the association in absolute disgrace and trigger a brutal state investigation. But in the military, we are taught that destruction is the easiest thing in the world to accomplish. Anyone can tear a structure down. The difficult part, the part that actually requires leadership, is building something that lasts. I stood up. I did not touch my microphone, but I raised a hand, and the room slowly quieted down. "I am not moving for a resignation tonight," I said, projecting my voice so every person could hear me perfectly. The room went entirely silent. Richard looked up at me, his eyes wide with profound shock. He fully expected me to deliver the killing blow. Pushing one man out of a chair does not fix the underlying problem. I continued looking directly at the crowd. If we just cycle a new person into this exact same broken system, we will eventually end up right back here. The problem is not just who holds the wooden gavel. The problem is what we allow that gavel to hit. I looked down at Richard. He was pale, trembling slightly, and completely stripped of his arrogant armor. He knew I had been digging through the financial records. He knew exactly what was in my manila folder, and he knew I was choosing to hold my fire. "We are going to change the standard," I announced to the room. "Instead of weaponizing our bylaws to fine our vulnerable neighbors when their health fails, we are going to actively support them. I am formally proposing the immediate creation of a volunteer neighborhood fund. We will allocate a small portion of our yearly budget to purchase basic supplies. Once a month, volunteers will handle the heavy exterior maintenance for any resident over the age of 70 or anyone battling a severe medical crisis. No impossible fines, no manufactured liens, just basic decency." The retired school teacher looked at me, a genuine smile breaking across her face. "I second that motion," she said loudly. The board voted unanimously. Even Richard, broken and entirely humiliated, slowly raised his hand to weakly cast a yes vote. He remained the president in title, but his reign of terror was permanently over. He knew I held the leverage, and his holding company scam was entirely neutralized because we simply stopped allowing properties to fall into manufactured debt. The electric golf cart patrols stopped. The petty orange envelopes disappeared forever. A week later, our newly formed volunteer crew met at Arthur's house. I brought my brand new mower. The accountant brought a weed trimmer. 2 local teenagers painted the fading trim around the front windows. Arthur sat on his front porch, a cup of hot coffee in his hands, telling the teenagers stories about his time as an Army engineer in the 1960s. The heavy wooden cane was gone. The metal walker remained, but his quiet, intense pride had fully returned. His meticulously folded American flag rested perfectly on its wooden display block. Sometimes, the people who desperately crave authority are exactly the people who should never be allowed to wield it. They assume that because you choose not to brag, you have nothing to brag about. They fail to understand that a truly capable person does not need to manufacture chaos to prove their strength. Real leadership is not about how loudly you can shout orders or how ruthlessly you can punish someone for a peeling coat of paint. It is the absolute willingness to stand between a vulnerable person and the danger approaching them. We all have the capacity to enforce a standard. The true test of our character is whether we use that standard to build our community up or tear it down. Not because we want the credit, because it is simply the right thing to do. If this story resonated with you, and you believe that true strength is measured in the quiet defense of others, please hit the subscribe button and join our community. I read every single comment, so let me know down below. Have you ever encountered someone who completely abused their small amount of power? And how was it finally handled? I have another powerful story queued up on your screen right now about a Navy nurse who uncovered a devastating secret in a local hospital and the impossible choice she had to make. Thank you for spending a small part of your day with me. Stay strong, take care of your neighbors, and I will see you in the next one.